March 23, 1945, Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. The rain fell in sheets across the volcanic slopes of Matabu Peninsula, turning the red clay earth into rivers of rust-colored mud. Through the downpour, a column of women moved in silence, 37 figures wrapped in torn kimonos and military-issue blankets, their wooden sandals sinking into the sodden ground with each reluctant step. They were prisoners now, though the word felt foreign on their tongues. Behind them, the sound of artillery had finally ceased. Before them, American voices called out in a language that sounded like gravel tumbling through water. In the center of the column walked Nakamura Fumiko, a 24-year-old auxiliary nurse who had spent the previous 8 days hiding in a limestone cave with 17 other women, drinking rainwater that pooled in rock crevices and eating nothing but the memory of rice. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from the certainty of what awaited. She had been told since childhood what happened to women captured by the enemy. The propaganda films shown in every village hall, the whispered stories passed between mothers and daughters, the explicit instructions given by officers of the Imperial Army, all of it converged on a single, terrible truth. Capture meant violation, torture, and death. Better to die by one's own hand than to fall into American custody. Yet here she was, alive and walking. The grenade she had been issued remained unused in her pocket, its pin still secure. When the American soldiers had appeared at the cave entrance 3 hours earlier, she had reached for it. Her fingers had closed around the cold metal, but then something impossible had happened. The soldier at the cave mouth, a boy who looked barely old enough to shave, had held out his hands, palms open, and spoken a single word in broken Japanese: Anzen. Safe. The column reached the perimeter of what the Americans called a civilian collection point, though to Fumiko it looked more like a small city constructed overnight. Canvas tents stretched in neat rows across a muddy field. Smoke rose from field kitchens. Japanese civilians, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, moved freely between structures, unguarded, alive. Children ran between the tents. Old men sat on wooden crates, smoking cigarettes. Women hung laundry on ropes strung between poles. Fumiko stopped walking. The woman behind her bumped into her back, but Fumiko couldn't move. This wasn't possible. This was propaganda, a trick, an elaborate deception designed to please this way, a voice said in careful textbook Japanese. An American soldier, a translator patch on his shoulder, gestured toward a large tent marked with a red cross. The medical officer will see you now. There is food after, hot food. Hot food. The words seemed to come from another language entirely, one that belonged to a world that no longer existed. The mythology of capture had been carefully constructed over years of total war. In every corner of the Japanese Empire, from the northernmost reaches of Manchuria to the southern jungles of the Philippines, civilians had been taught a singular narrative. The Americans were demons in human form, savages who raped and murdered without mercy, soldiers of a nation so barbaric that prisoners could expect only degradation and death. This wasn't simply military propaganda designed for soldiers. It was a comprehensive social doctrine that permeated every level of Japanese society, from primary school textbooks to Buddhist temple sermons. The roots ran deep into Japanese military culture itself. The Imperial Army's field manual, the Senjinkan, issued to every soldier in 1941, contained explicit instructions regarding capture. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor. For soldiers, this meant fighting to the death or committing suicide rather than surrendering. For civilians, particularly women, the implications were even more explicit. Military authorities distributed grenades to civilian women in contested territories with clear instructions. Use them on yourselves and your children before allowing capture. This doctrine was reinforced through every available channel. School children watched films depicting Americans as Oni, traditional Japanese demons with horns and fangs. Newspapers published lurid accounts of atrocities committed by American forces, most of them fabricated or grotesquely exaggerated. Radio broadcasts reminded citizens daily that capture meant a fate worse than death. In Okinawa, as American forces approached, local military authorities went village to village, distributing grenades and demonstrating their use. Women were instructed in the proper way to hold explosives close to their bodies to ensure complete family annihilation. The psychology was simple and devastatingly effective. Make death preferable to capture. Convince the population that the enemy was so monstrous that no fate could be worse than falling into their hands. Create a scenario where mass suicide became not just acceptable but honorable. What Japanese authorities did not anticipate was this. Some people's survival instinct would override their indoctrination. Some would reach for the grenade and find themselves unable to pull the pin. Some would hear the American voices calling, "Come out. You are safe," and feel their certainty waver. Some would emerge from caves and jungle hideouts expecting death and instead encounter something their entire worldview had insisted was impossible: restraint, procedure, and in some cases, kindness. For the women who survived capture, the cognitive dissonance was immediate and total. Everything they knew to be true about the world suddenly inverted. The collision between expectation and reality was so violent that many would later describe it in almost mystical terms, as if they had died and been reborn into a different universe entirely. April 2, 1945. Civilian internment camp Aishima. Tanaka Yashiko had been a prisoner for 9 days when she first encountered chocolate. She was 31 years old, the widow of a naval officer killed at Midway, and until the Americans landed she had managed a small school for girls in Naha. When the evacuation order came, she fled north with her students, 17 girls between the ages of 8 and 14. In the chaos of the retreat, she lost all but 4 of them. Those 4 now sat with her in a tent designated for women with dependent children, staring at the brown rectangles wrapped in waxed paper that an American soldier had distributed without ceremony or explanation. "It's poison," whispered one of the girls, a 12-year-old named Keiko whose parents had been killed in the initial bombardment. "They want us to eat it so they don't have to shoot us." Yashiko held the chocolate bar in her palm, feeling its weight. It was substantial, heavy, wrapped in packaging that crinkled when touched. The wrapper bore English words she couldn't read and a picture of what appeared to be mountains. Through the tent flap, she could see American soldiers moving between structures, carrying crates, directing traffic, their movements efficient and purposeful. None of them looked at the tent. None of them seemed to care what the women inside did. A voice spoke from the other side of the tent. "It's food, candy. The Americans give it to everyone." Yashiko turned. An older woman, perhaps 60, sat on a cot near the rear wall. She had already unwrapped her chocolate and broken off a piece. As Yashiko watched, the woman placed it in her mouth. "You'll die," Keiko said. The older woman smiled. It was the first smile Yashiko had seen in weeks. "Then I'll die full," she said, "better than starving out of fear." The logic was undeniable. They were prisoners. If the Americans wanted them dead, there were far more efficient methods than poisoned candy. Yashiko unwrapped the chocolate bar, the wax paper tearing easily. The smell that emerged was unlike anything she had encountered, rich, sweet, complex. She broke off a small square, the chocolate snapping cleanly, and placed it on her tongue. The taste was overwhelming. Sweet, yes, but not simply sweet. There was depth to it, a complexity of flavor that her starved palate could barely process. It melted almost immediately, coating her mouth, and for a moment she forgot where she was, forgot the war, forgot everything except the sensation of flavor after weeks of nothing but whatever could be scavenged from the jungle. When she opened her eyes, Keiko was staring at her. "Is it poison?" Yashiko swallowed. "No," she said, "it's chocolate, it's food." Within minutes, all 4 girls were eating their rations. The tent filled with the sound of crinkling wrappers and small, involuntary sounds of pleasure. It was such a simple thing, a bar of chocolate, a moment of sweetness. But in that tent on Aishima, it represented something far larger than its physical substance. It was evidence, proof that everything they had been told might be wrong. The United States military approach to civilian prisoners during the Pacific Campaign was governed by a complex web of regulations, military necessity, and though this was rarely acknowledged in official documentation, a deliberate propaganda strategy. The Army Civil Affairs Handbook for Japan, prepared in 1944 in anticipation of invasion, explicitly addressed the treatment of civilian prisoners. Its directives were clear. Civilians were to be treated humanely, fed adequately, provided medical care, and protected from violence. But beneath these humanitarian principles lay a strategic calculation. American military leadership understood that word of prisoner treatment would spread. Every civilian who survived capture became a potential counter-propaganda agent, a living refutation of Japanese military claims about American barbarism. The logistics were staggering. By the summer of 1945, American forces were managing civilian prisoner populations that numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the Pacific. On Okinawa alone, the civilian collection points eventually held over 300,000 people, more than the entire pre-war population of some American cities. Feeding this population required a supply chain that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The numbers tell their own story. In May 1945, American forces on Okinawa distributed approximately 7,200 tons of food to civilian prisoners. This included rice purchased from neutral nations, canned vegetables, powdered milk for children, and yes, chocolate bars, part of standard military rations that were shared with prisoners when supplies allowed. The medical care provided was equally systematic. Field hospitals treated civilian prisoners alongside wounded American soldiers. Doctors inoculated children against typhoid and cholera. Nurses taught basic sanitation procedures to prevent disease outbreaks in the crowded camps. Supply records from the 10th Army show that in April 1945 alone, military doctors treated over 15,000 civilian prisoners for conditions ranging from malnutrition to shrapnel wounds to childbirth complications. The mortality rate among civilian prisoners in American custody was significantly lower than the mortality rate among civilians who remained in Japanese-controlled territory. This wasn't altruism, not exactly. It was calculated policy informed by both humanitarian principles and strategic thinking. But for the women emerging from caves and jungle hideouts expecting death, the motivation mattered less than the result. They were alive. They were fed. Their children were being vaccinated. The cognitive dissonance was total. April 15, 1945. Women's Compound, Zamami Island. The letters began arriving in the third week. Not letters in the traditional sense. No mail system existed that could carry correspondence from American-held territories back to Japan. These were messages written on scraps of paper, pages torn from military notebooks, backs of propaganda leaflets. Women wrote them knowing they might never be delivered, but writing them anyway, compelled by the need to document what they were experiencing, to bear witness to the impossible. Hayashi Michiko was 28, a former teacher, and in the months before capture she had kept a diary documenting the destruction of Okinawan society under the weight of total war. Her entries from February 1945 recorded the forced evacuation of villages, the distribution of grenades to civilians, the growing certainty that death was inevitable. Her entry from March 31st, the day before her capture, consisted of a single sentence: "Tomorrow we will die with honor." But she didn't die. And now, sitting in a tent that housed 43 women, she wrote a different kind of entry. Her hands shook as she formed the characters, not from hunger. She had eaten that morning rice and fish and vegetables from American stores, but from the difficulty of putting into words what she was experiencing. "They do not touch us," she wrote. "The soldiers come to the tent perimeter but never enter. When they must speak to us, they call for the translator. Yesterday a woman went into labor. They brought a doctor, a woman doctor American who spoke no Japanese but whose hands were gentle. The baby was born healthy. The mother lives. The child lives. They gave her milk powder and clean cloth for diapers. This morning I watched American soldiers build additional latrines, digging in the mud to improve sanitation. They work like common laborers, no different from the lowest ranks. I do not understand what we are witnessing. Everything we were told was a lie. Everything. The letters accumulated, hidden in pockets, sewn into hems, tucked between pages of the few books that had survived. Some women wrote daily, compulsively documenting every detail that contradicted their previous understanding of reality. Others wrote only once, a single testament to their survival. The common thread running through all of them was shock, not the shock of violence experienced but violence absent, the profound disorientation of encountering humanity where only brutality had been promised. Nakamura Fumiko, the nurse who had carried an unused grenade out of her cave, wrote 14 pages in the week following her capture. Her account is one of the few that survived the war intact, preserved because she eventually gave it to a translator who kept it rather than destroying it. Her words capture the peculiar quality of that cognitive dislocation. The third day they gave us soap. Real soap, not the crude lye cakes we had been using. The smell made me weep. I stood in the washing area. They had constructed washing areas with privacy screens made of canvas, and I held the soap and cried like a child. Not because I was grateful, though perhaps I should have been. I cried because soap meant they intended to keep us alive. Soap meant they saw us as human beings who required cleanliness. Soap meant everything I had been taught about the enemy was wrong. If they had lied about this, what else was a lie? What had we sacrificed for lies? The question haunted many of the women. They had lost husbands, sons, fathers to a war predicated on the notion that Americans were existential enemies, demons who would destroy Japanese civilization if given the chance. They had endured starvation, bombardment, and the psychological torture of knowing their own military had given them grenades and told them to die rather than survive. And now they sat in American camps, alive, fed, unmolested, protected from the very elements that had nearly killed them, and confronted a truth that invalidated the justification for everything they had suffered. The psychological impact was profound and varied. Some women experienced what military psychiatrists would later term ideological collapse, a complete loss of faith in the worldview that had structured their entire lives. Others clung to fragments of the old certainty, insisting that the humane treatment was temporary, a trick that would eventually reveal its true nature. Many oscillated between these extremes, their minds struggling to reconcile irreconcilable narratives. But everyone, regardless of their psychological response, had to confront the basic material facts. They were prisoners who were being kept alive, fed, and treated with a degree of dignity that they had been assured was impossible. The war had taught them to expect death. America was teaching them, involuntarily, systematically, that survival was possible. May 7, 1945, Interrogation Center, Kadena Airfield. The interviews were conducted by military intelligence officers, linguists, and anthropologists in uniform. The official purpose was intelligence gathering, information about Japanese military positions, civilian morale, the location of holdouts and supply caches. But the unofficial purpose, documented in internal military communications, was psychological assessment. American military planners wanted to understand the depth of Japanese indoctrination, the effectiveness of counterpropaganda, the possibility of using captured civilians as intermediaries in convincing holdouts to surrender. Captain James Morrison, a military intelligence officer who had studied Japanese at Yale before the war, conducted over 200 interviews with female civilian prisoners in the spring of 1945. His reports, filed with the 10th Army's Intelligence Section, provide a remarkable window into the collision of worldviews that was occurring in the camps. Interview subject 147, Morrison wrote in his report dated May 7, 1945. Female, age approximately 35, former elementary school teacher from Shuri. Subject captured April 12th after spending 19 days hiding in a family tomb with 7 other civilians. Subject initially refused to leave tomb despite severe malnutrition and water deprivation. When finally convinced to emerge, subject attempted to resist by going limp, forcing soldiers to carry her to collection point. Subject would not speak for first 3 days of captivity. Morrison's notes continue. On the 4th day, subject's daughter, age 11, developed fever. Subject approached guards and through translator requested medical help. Daughter was taken to field hospital, treated for dehydration and early-stage dysentery, and returned to mother's custody after 2 days. Subject's demeanor changed markedly afterward. When questioned about her initial resistance, subject stated, translated, "We were told you would separate children from mothers. We were told children would be killed or worse. When my daughter became sick, I had to choose between my belief and her life. I chose her life. You returned her to me. I do not understand what you are." The phrase recurs throughout Morrison's reports. I do not understand what you are. The women he interviewed struggled to categorize their captors, to fit American behavior into a framework that made sense within their understanding of war, civilization, and human nature. The propaganda had painted Americans as barbarians, racial inferiors, a people without culture or honor. But the reality they encountered contradicted this at every point. American soldiers followed rules, respected boundaries, distributed resources systematically rather than arbitrarily. When Japanese civilians violated camp rules, stealing food, fighting among themselves, attempting to escape, they were punished with confinement or reduced rations, not execution. The proportionality of response was itself shocking to women who had seen Japanese military police execute civilians for far lesser infractions. One interview subject told Morrison, "In Saipan, I heard, the Japanese soldiers threw Okinawan civilians off cliffs to save ammunition. Here, your soldiers spend ammunition and time to bring us food. What kind of enemy does this? What kind of war is this where the enemy feeds you?" The question went to the heart of the ideological framework that had sustained Japanese militarism. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, the ideological justification for Japanese expansion, was predicated on racial hierarchy and the supposed superiority of Japanese civilization over Western barbarism. Japanese propaganda consistently portrayed Americans as racist, materialistic, spiritually empty, a people who valued machines over honor, money over loyalty. The goal of the war, as explained in countless propaganda broadcasts, was to preserve Asian civilization from Western corruption. But in the camps, women encountered a different reality. They watched African American soldiers, men the propaganda had described as slaves and subhumans, perform the same duties as white soldiers, often commanding white subordinates. They saw women in uniform, American nurses and WACs, exercising authority in ways that Japanese military culture considered impossible. They observed religious services, Christian, Jewish, and even Buddhist services organized for Japanese prisoners, conducted with a casual pluralism that seemed impossible in a society they had been taught was rigidly hierarchical and spiritually bankrupt. The cognitive dissonance wasn't simply about survival, it was about civilization itself. Everything they had been taught about American society was being contradicted by daily experience. And if the propaganda had lied about this, what else was a lie? June 3, 1945. Civilian Camp, Matabu Peninsula. The library appeared in the second week of June. It consisted of a single tent, 40 books in Japanese, and a hand-lettered sign in careful calligraphy that read Reading Room. The books had been collected from various sources, captured Japanese military libraries, donations from Nisei soldiers, volumes purchased through neutral intermediaries in Switzerland and Sweden. The collection was eclectic, Pre-war novels, poetry collections, Buddhist texts, even a few children's books. An American chaplain, working with Japanese-speaking volunteers from among the prisoners, had organized the tent and established simple rules. Books could be borrowed for 1 week, must be returned in good condition. Children had priority for the children's books. Yamamoto Haruko was the first woman through the door. She was 43, a widow, a former librarian from Naha whose life before the war had centered on books and the quiet transmission of culture. When the evacuation came, she had tried to bring books with her, carrying a bag of volumes until the weight became unbearable, and she abandoned them on a muddy trail somewhere in the northern hills. She had mourned those books more than she mourned most of the other things she had lost. The tent smelled of canvas and mildew, but also of paper and binding glue, the smell of books, unmistakable and profound. Haruko stood just inside the entrance, overwhelmed. An American soldier sat at a small desk, a young man with thick glasses who looked up from his paperwork and smiled. "Please," he said in accented but serviceable Japanese, gesturing to the shelves. "Please look, choose." Haruko moved along the shelves, her fingers trailing over spines. Here was a collection of Basho's haiku. Here was a pre-war novel by Tanizaki. Here was a volume of children's stories she had read to students years ago. She pulled a book from the shelf almost at random, a collection of Zen poetry, and opened it to the middle. "The barn burned down. Now I can see the moon." She closed the book carefully and carried it to the desk. The soldier made a notation in a ledger, writing her name in careful katakana, and handed the book back to her. "2 weeks," he said. "You can keep for 2 weeks. After, if you want more, come back." Haruko walked back to her tent holding the book like a piece of the world she had thought was gone forever. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp the Americans had provided, she read the entire volume. The next morning, 3 other women asked to borrow it. By the end of the week, a waiting list had formed. The library became a focal point of camp life, in ways its organizers had not anticipated. Women gathered in the tent not just to read, but to talk about what they were reading, to debate interpretations, to recite memorized poems. Younger women who could read English began teaching others, using the few English-language texts available. The tent became a space apart, a place where the mental architecture of pre-war life could be partially reconstructed. But it was also a place of profound unease. These were the enemy's books, provided by the enemy, in a tent constructed by the enemy for the benefit of prisoners. The very act of accepting this gift felt like a kind of betrayal, of the nation, of the dead, of the sacrifices that had been demanded. Yet the alternative was to refuse, to reject this small piece of cultural continuity, to deny themselves this fragment of normalcy. Nakamura Fumiko, the nurse, borrowed a medical text in the 3rd week of June. It was in Japanese, a pre-war textbook on tropical diseases, and she studied it compulsively, trying to understand the treatments being used in the camp hospital. When she returned it, she spoke to the soldier at the desk. "Why do you do this?" she asked. "Why give us books?" The soldier, Private Michael Chen, a Nisei from California, looked at her for a long moment. "Because you are people," he said finally. "Because people need books." The answer was so simple it was almost insulting. Yet it contained a philosophy that contradicted everything the Japanese military had taught. In the Imperial Army's worldview, the enemy was monolithic, subhuman, incapable of recognizing the humanity of others. But here was an enemy soldier expressing a belief in universal human dignity, so casual he stated it as an obvious fact. The books, like the chocolate, like the soap, like the medical care, became symbols of a reality that refused to match the narrative. Each object was a small testament to a different kind of civilization, one that valued individual dignity even in war, that saw feeding prisoners and providing them books as sensible rather than absurd. Cumulatively, these small evidences built a counter-narrative that was all the more powerful for being enacted rather than spoken. July 12, 1945. Agricultural Project Aishima. The war garden began as a pragmatic measure. By midsummer 1945, the civilian prisoner population on Aishima had grown to over 20,000 people, straining supply lines and creating logistical headaches for military administrators. A forward-thinking lieutenant colonel named Richard Hammond proposed a solution: put the prisoners to work growing their own food. The proposal made its way up the chain of command and received approval with remarkable speed. Within 2 weeks, a 10-acre plot had been cleared, seeds and tools had been sourced, and prisoners were being organized into agricultural work groups. For many of the women, this was the first time since capture that they were given productive work. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These were women who had spent months in idleness, first hiding in caves and jungle, then sitting in camps waiting for death or release, and the opportunity to work, to produce something, to exercise autonomy even in small ways, was transformative. Tanaka Yashiko, the teacher who had first tasted chocolate on Aishima, volunteered for the agricultural detail in the first week. She was assigned to a group of 12 women, given a plot of land, seeds for squash and radishes, and basic tools. An American agricultural specialist, a former farmer from Iowa who had been drafted into military government work, provided instructions through a translator. The work was hard, the soil was rocky, the heat brutal, the tools barely adequate, but it was work with a visible purpose. Within days, the first shoots appeared. Within weeks, the plants were thriving. The women developed a routine: mornings in the field, afternoons processing the harvest, evenings in the tent compound discussing plans for the next day's work. Something unexpected happened. The work groups developed their own internal structures, their own forms of organization. Leaders emerged, not through military hierarchy, but through competence and consensus. Decisions were made collectively. Resources were shared based on need rather than rank. It was, in miniature, a form of democratic organization that bore no resemblance to the rigid hierarchies that had governed their lives before the war. Yashiko found herself thinking about this late one evening, sitting outside her tent watching the sunset. In Japan, under military rule, every aspect of life had been regimented from above. Women were told what to think, how to behave, what to believe. Dissent was crushed. Independence was suspect. The ideal woman was obedient, self-sacrificing, devoted to the collective as defined by the state. But here, in a prisoner camp, she was making decisions. She was choosing which crops to plant, how to organize labor, how to distribute the harvest. The Americans provided the land and tools but left the actual operation to the prisoners. It was a strange kind of freedom, constrained, certainly, occurring within a barbed wire perimeter, but freedom nonetheless. By August, the agricultural project was producing significant yields. The prisoners' diet improved. Morale rose. Women who had arrived in camp malnourished and traumatized were gaining weight, regaining health, rediscovering the capacity for hope. The transformation was visible in camp photographs taken by military documentarians. Images from April showed hollow-eyed women staring at the camera with expressions of shock or terror. Images from August showed women working in fields, children playing in the background, a few tentative smiles. The gardens became another form of evidence, another piece of the counter-narrative. These were prisoners who were being allowed to work, to organize themselves, to keep the fruits of their labor. It contradicted not just the propaganda about American barbarism, but also the fundamental assumptions about how prisoners should be treated, assumptions built into Japanese military culture. In the Imperial Army, prisoners, on the rare occasions the Japanese took prisoners, were treated as subhuman, worked to death or executed at convenience. The idea that prisoners might be given autonomy, might be trusted with tools that could be used as weapons, might be allowed to organize themselves without constant supervision. This was incomprehensible within the framework of Japanese militarism. Yet here it was, happening daily, visibly. and the women living through it had to reconcile this reality with everything they thought they knew about the world. August 9, 1945, Women's Compound, Okinawa. The news reached the camp in fragments, carried by interpreters and translators who moved between the American military headquarters and the civilian compounds. The first atomic bomb had fallen on Hiroshima on August 6th. A second had destroyed Nagasaki on August 9th. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The phrases meant little to most of the women. Atomic bomb was a term without referent. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities they had never seen. Manchuria was distant and abstract. But they understood the interpreter's tone, the shock in the translators' voices, the sudden urgency in American military movements throughout the camp. Hayashi Michiko, the former teacher who had kept a diary, tried to process what she was hearing. A single bomb that destroyed an entire city. A weapon of such magnitude that its existence seemed fantastical. She thought of the conventional bombs that had fallen on Okinawa, the terror of them, the destruction, the hours spent in caves while the earth shook. If what the interpreters said was true, if a single bomb could destroy an entire city, then the war was truly over. No nation could survive such weapons. The emotional response in the camp was complex and contradictory. Some women felt relief, the war was ending, the killing would stop. Others felt despair, Japan was being destroyed, the homeland was burning. Many felt both simultaneously, their minds unable to settle on a single response. But underlying everything was a deeper current of shock. These bombs, these impossible weapons, they existed. The Americans had built them. The nation they had been taught to see as spiritually bankrupt and technologically inferior had created weapons that made conventional warfare obsolete. On August 15th, the emperor's voice came over the radio. The women gathered in the largest tent, sitting in rows, listening to the thin, high voice speaking in formal court Japanese that many could barely understand. The jeweled voice broadcast, it was called later, the first time the emperor had spoken directly to the people. His words were oblique, circling around direct statements, but the meaning was clear. Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The silence in the tent after the broadcast ended was total. Some women wept. Others sat motionless, faces blank. A few stood and walked out, needing to be alone. Yashiko, the teacher, felt nothing. The numbness was complete. She had survived a war that killed millions. She had been captured by enemies who fed her and gave her seeds to plant. She had lived through the impossible, and now the impossible had occurred. Japan had surrendered, the unthinkable had happened. The nation that could never lose had lost. That night, lying in her cot, Yashiko tried to imagine the future. What would happen now? Would they be sent back to Japan? Would there be a Japan to return to, or would the entire nation be destroyed by atomic fire? What would life look like in a defeated Japan? Who would she be in a world where everything she had been taught about Japanese superiority and American barbarism had been revealed as lies? She had no answers, but she was alive to ask the questions, and that itself was a kind of miracle. September 20th, 1945, Repatriation Center, Naha. The process of return began in early September. Ships arrived from the Philippines and Guam, massive transport vessels that would carry Japanese civilians back to the homeland. The women packed their few possessions, clothing provided by the Americans, some personal items that had survived the war, a few treasured books from the camp library that they had been allowed to keep. They lined up for medical inspections, for documentation processing, for the endless bureaucratic procedures that accompanied military operations of any scale. Nakamura Fumiko stood in line with her discharge papers, watching the harbor. She had gained 20 pounds since capture, her body recovering from months of malnutrition. Her hands, which had trembled constantly in the weeks after her capture, were steady now. She was going home, back to whatever remained of Okinawa, back to a Japan that had surrendered, back to a life she could not imagine. A military chaplain moved down the line, distributing care packages to the women waiting to board. Each package contained basic supplies: soap, a towel, a small first aid kit, and a letter in Japanese explaining that they were gifts from the American people, tokens of goodwill for the peace to come. Fumiko accepted hers with a bow, the gesture automatic and probably futile. The chaplain wouldn't understand its meaning, but necessary nonetheless. On the ship, she found a place on the crowded deck and watched Aishima recede into the distance. She thought about the cave where she had hidden, about the grenade she had carried but not used, about the American soldier who had called out Anzin while she crouched in darkness trying to decide whether to die. She thought about chocolate and soap and libraries and gardens. She thought about all the small evidences of a civilization she had been taught did not exist. The woman next to her on the deck spoke suddenly. "Do you think we'll be able to tell them when we get back?" "Tell them what?" Fumiko asked. "What it was like, what they did, that they didn't." The woman trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence. Fumiko knew what she meant. The women returning carried with them a truth that contradicted the narrative that had sustained Japanese militarism. The enemy was not demonic, conquest did not guarantee honor, and the Americans had treated their prisoners better than the Japanese military had treated its own civilians. This was a truth that would be difficult to speak in a defeated Japan, where the narratives of victimization and noble sacrifice were already being constructed, where the myth of Japanese innocence was replacing the myth of Japanese superiority. "I don't know," Fumiko said finally. "I don't know if they'll believe us. I don't know if I believe it myself, and I lived through it." The ship's horn sounded, a deep bellow that echoed across the water. The engines engaged, churning the sea into foam. The women on deck stood silent, watching the island disappear, each carrying her own private accounting of what had been lost and what, impossibly, had been preserved. The final statistics paint a picture in numbers. Between April and September 1945, American forces on Okinawa processed approximately 300,000 civilian prisoners. The mortality rate among these prisoners was approximately 3%, most deaths occurring in the first weeks of captivity due to malnutrition and disease contracted before capture. By comparison, the mortality rate among Okinawan civilians who remained in Japanese-controlled territory during the same period was estimated at over 40%. The numbers tell a story that the propaganda could not accommodate. Prisoners in American custody were far more likely to survive than civilians under Japanese military protection. The women who survived carried this knowledge with them into the post-war world. Some spoke about their experiences, though their testimonies were often dismissed or ignored in the immediate post-war period, when Japan was constructing new narratives about victimhood and suffering. Others remained silent, the gap between what they experienced and what they were supposed to have experienced too wide to bridge with words.